on today's show, I wanted to do a list of my top 10 NBA teams of all times. Now, with a list like this, it can be pretty hard to narrow this down, so I'm not going to do this based on the eye test or if this team played this team type of rating or rankings, if you will. This is simply what they did during their respective season. I came up with my criteria to make up the why behind each of them actually making the list. Those are offensive rating, defensive ratings, games won in the season, so that's regular season and postseason, all-stars or Hall of Famers on the team, and finally, did they win the chip? Because you can't be a greatest team of all time if you did not win. Sorry, 73-9 Golden State Warriors. I'm going to start with number 10 and work my way down the list from that. So my number 10 team of all time would be the 2012-2013 Miami Heat. So I know some old school NBA fans and even modern day fans hated the super team thing. So I do understand that. I do understand that some might not like the fact that the Miami Heat makes the list of top 10 all-time teams. I do know that some might want them to be higher, but when you talk about greatest teams of all time, I don't see how to get them any higher on the list, but they are for sure a great team and belong to be in the top 10, and here's why. They have the second longest win streak in a season with 27 straight wins in the regular season. And during that year, they actually improved in a lot of ratings compared to the year prior to when they actually won the title. They were top 5 in points per game, top 5 in opponents' points per game, and their offensive rating that year was second. They also won the most games that year for any team in the league in a regular season, and they had the league MVP and 2 other All-Stars on that team, and of course Dwayne Wade and Chris Bosh. LeBron James was MVP that year. I know some might bring up how they went 7 games with the Indiana Pacers in the East and then should have lost to the Spurs if not for one of the greatest clutch shots in NBA history by Ray Allen. But even with that said, the stats that this team put up that year were undeniable, and they did win the championship regardless of how they won it. Due to the narrowness of the win, though, is why I have them here and no higher. The next team on my list, some people debate and say that this version of the Chicago Bulls were the best, and I already know that I'm going to get some hate for having any Michael Jordan team this low, but even though Mike is the GOAT, in my opinion, and this team was great, the 1991-92 Bulls is a top 10 team, but 9 is the spot that they belong in, and here's why. That year, they finished the top seed in all the NBA, and even though their offensive rating was first, and their defensive rating was good, being 4th overall. However, the main reason I have them here is during the playoffs, their record was 15-7, which isn't the worst, but it's not, beating the brakes off teams they competed against either. This team also had 2 All-Stars and a Hall of Famer on it. Horace Grant did make the All-Star team, but that was actually after this season, even though a lot of people saw him, as an all-star caliber talent. This team was all-world, but even with that, I couldn't put them any higher than 9th because the next 8 are even better than them. So they go to my number 8 team that's on my list. So the last three-peat we had was all the way back in the ancient year of 2003, and the Kobe and Shaq Lakers were certainly a force to be reckoned with. The 2000-2001 team, for sure, was the best of that team's three-peat for a few reasons. Their playoff record was almost perfect with a 15-1 run through the playoffs that only saw them lose to an Allen Iverson-led Philadelphia 76ers team when he just went nuts in Game 1, with the iconic stepping over Ty Lue thing happening. Other than that, though, they curb stomped everyone in the playoffs, which included the Chris Webber, Lottie Divac Sacramento Kings and the Tim Duncan, David Robinson-led San Antonio Spurs. That year, the Lakers had the #1 record in all of basketball, and they had a top 3 offense in the league as well. And even though their defensive rating wasn't that good, I think it was like 10th or something like that. When needed, though, they could actually lock the other team down if needed. For me, Kobe and Shaq as a duo is top 3, and with this team, they did deserve a spot on this list. But, of course, 8th is as high as I can put them, even with Shaq and Kobe being as great and as dominant as they are. Let's go to my number 7 team on the list. And during the 1980s, for the most part in the East, we had one team dominate the conference, and that honestly would be the Boston Celtics. In that decade, they went to the finals half of those years, so they went 5 times and was able to win 3 titles. Having said that, the 85-86 team was the best of the Celtics teams in their storied history of that era, led by the Hick from French Lick and Larry Bird. That was a nickname he gave himself or somebody gave him. Don't hate on me for that nickname. That was Larry, just using it. They had a top 5 offensive rating and was #1 in defensive rating as well. They had the best record in the league and had a 15-3 record in the postseason. That team had 5 Hall of Famers on it with Larry Bird, Danny Ainge, Kevin McHale, Robert Parrish, and Bill Walton, which would explain why they were so hard to beat. Some argue them as a top 3 team of all time and possibly the greatest Celtics team ever. But while they were impressive, I have them slotted here. Let's go to my number 6 team on my greatest teams of all time list. And that would be the 1962-63 Boston Celtics team. Now, this team for me, of all the Boston Celtics teams, was the best ever. And I already know that because of, most people probably listening to this are going to say and be like, these guys back in the day could only dribble with one hand and only played against out-of-shape plumbers. So why do you have them here? But when you're looking at a team or a player for that matter, historically, you have to judge them back by the era of which they played and the way the game was played during that time to provide historical context. I don't like when people say, well, if you put Bob Cousy into the league today, well, first, if you just took a player from an old school era and dropped them in this era, they're not going to look so good. Just like if you dropped, Patrick Beverly into the league back then, he would probably be the best player in the league because that's just dropping an advancement of skill into an era that was less advanced at the time. That doesn't make that player in that era any less great because, again, if they had the same skill, if they had the same knowledge and the same tools, we don't know how they would be. That would be like, again, 50, 75 years from now, players then can look back at this era and just be like, God, you guys are sorry. So can't do that, had to judge them based on their era. Having said that, the 1962-63 Boston Celtics, for me, is the greatest Celtic team ever, and it was because of the way they dominated the league. When you look at their postseason record that year, you wouldn't think that they were that dominant since there were no sweeps during the playoffs, but when you dive into the overall stats of what that team put up, you'll see why I have them here. They had the best record in the league that year, and it wasn't even close, by the way. And they had the #1 defensive rating that year, led by the league MVP at that time in Bill Russell, and their net rating was #1 as well. Now, for anyone listening that doesn't know or might not be familiar with what net rating is, just in short, it's basically how much better or worse your team is when players are on the court at the same time. So if your team is #1, that just means that the whole team plays extremely well together, which is a very hard thing to do. This Celtics team had seven Hall of Famers on them, which of course certainly points out why they were able to kick everyone's teeth in for so long as they did, winning a ridiculous amount of championships during that era. They were actually the KD, Steph, Golden State Warriors before these Warriors became hard to beat, when they assembled their squad together. But the 62-63 Boston Celtics, greatest Celtic team of all time, which leads me into another team that could be argued as the greatest team ever, but definitely deserves to be on this list. And that is the team that is known for 4-4-4. That was this team's nickname. And before the playoffs started, a gentleman by the name of Moses predicted this, and that's what happened. When the 82-83 76ers added the great Moses Malone to that roster that had Dr. J and Maurice Cheeks and Bobby Jones to it, then yeah, they had a shot to run over the league, and they did just that. During this season, they had the best record in the league, a top 5 offense and defense, and their team's net rating was number 1. During this infamous 4-4-4 playoff run, they swept the Bernard King-led Knicks and the Magic, Kareem, and James Worthy Lakers in the NBA Finals, which is just heck of impressive considering who the Lakers were during the 1980s. Truth be told, I wanted to put them higher on the list, but to be fair and objective, I placed them here in history where they belong as a top 5 all-time team. Let's go to number 4 on my list. So I know I just got done talking about how this same team got swept in the finals by the 76ers, but the 80s just had some crazy teams to try and beat back then. And even with the Lakers in the 80s, they were by far and away the team of that decade. And to be honest, it wasn't even close. During those years, the Lakers made the NBA Finals 8 times in a 10-year span and won 5 of those titles. Of those 5 titles, the team that won in 84-85 season is the best of them, led by the captain in Kareem, who doesn't get the love, honestly, he deserves when you talk about greatest players ever, or even the GOAT for that matter. He doesn't. And then, of course, you had the greatest point guard ever in Magic. And then, of course, obviously, James Worthy being on that team, who's another Hall of Fame great player. That team had the best record in the league, the number 1 offense. After all, they were called Showtime for a reason. A top 10 defense and the number 1 net rated team that year. In the playoffs, they swept their first round opponent in Phoenix, beat the Sam Bowie and Clyde Drexler Trailblazers, both Hall of Famers, by the way, and beat the Boston Celtics with their 4 Hall of Fame players on it as well. This Lakers team was loaded with talent, and their play spoke just to that. I have 3 teams that are better than them, though, and it was tough to leave this team out of the top 3, but I just couldn't put them over these next 3 teams. As y'all already know, I am not a Lakers fan. I call them the Purple Puke for a reason. So I'm not a Lakers fan. However, I love some of the players that have played for that team. I really love Magic. I really love Kareem. As y'all know, I have him 3rd all time. Could argue 2nd, honestly, all time. But just couldn't put their team any higher on the list. And my 3rd greatest team of all time to move to them. So after the Cavs completed their 3-1 comeback over the Golden State Warriors, they were left stuck knowing that with the team that they had, they couldn't beat the LeBron, Kyrie, Kevin Love Cavs anymore. I think they had that feeling after they lost to them. That team, mind you, won a regular season league high in 73 games, had won a championship the year prior to, and even with that, they still thought that they couldn't beat the Cavs. Well, enter Kevin Durant to replace Harrison Barnes and pair him next to a 2-time league MVP in Steph. and 2 other Hall of Fame players in Klay Thompson and Draymond Green, and we get the 3rd greatest team of all time. Just in case you don't think that that's just not enough to have them here, let me provide some numbers to back this claim. They didn't win as many games as they had the year before, but they still had a league-leading 67 wins. They were the number 1 rated offense, number 2 in defense, and their net rating for the team is, I believe, the 2nd highest in league history. They were also top 5 in just about every other major team stat, like bench scoring, steals, and pace of play. In the playoffs, they soundly beat all of the teams they played up until the finals, and they only lost 1 game to the Cavs, and that only happened, honestly, because LeBron and Kyrie went nuts for 1 game. This same team went on to win the next year's finals and would have actually three-peated, I believe, if not for injuries. With that said, though, this team had everything you wanted for a Pantheon great team, and being top 3 for them is fitting. I know some people have argued that they were the greatest team of all time, but couldn't quite get there. Numbers were impressive, couldn't quite get there. Couldn't put them over my number 2 team, which out of the 17 championships that the Lakers have won, there is only one of those teams that stand out as the greatest of all time, and that would be the 71-72 team. This team had 3 Hall of Fame players on it, with Jerry West, who's the logo, Wilt Chamberlain, who is the stat book, and Elgin Baylor. And with those 3 Hall of Fame players, along with a cast of others, they ripped off a, still to this day, longest win streak in league history in 33 straight games. Now, before this team actually went into the playoffs, I believe Elgin Baylor did retire. So in basketball context, he doesn't get the credit for this team winning the title. But this team was the total package. They were number 1 in offensive and number 2 in defensive rating, and they have one of the highest net ratings in league history. I believe they're actually number 3 all time in that stat. And throughout the playoffs, they were kind of only challenged in the West Finals. But honestly, when you look at the score of those games that they lost, they could have actually easily won them, and that's playing against the league MVP at the time in Kareem. They were also top 10 in every major stat with the league's best record, and it wasn't even close when you look at their record compared to the 2nd place record at that time. Oh, at the time, by the way, they had the league record for most wins ever at 69 before their record was broken by this team that is number 1, and that would be the 1995-96 Chicago Bulls. So in this year, this is the Bulls team that after Michael Jordan came back from retirement, you got to remember when he came back in the 94-95 season, they lost, in 6 games to the Orlando Magic, because I think Mike had came back with like 10 games left in the regular season or something like that. And so, obviously was not ready to play, but, no excuses. He still lost in 6 to the Orlando Magic. And then this year came back with a vengeance. This team put up some ridiculous numbers. They have the highest net rating in league history. They were the number 1 offense and number 1 defense in the league. Of course, they had the best record in the league, and at the time was the regular season holder of best record in the league. They won the championship, and of course, they had 4 future Hall of Famers on that team with, of course, the Golden Mike, Scottie Pippen, Tony Kukoc, and Dennis Rodman. They swept pretty much their way through the first round. They beat Alonzo Mourning and Tim Hardaway, who are both Hall of Famers in the Miami Heat. They only lost 1 game to the Patrick Ewing-led New York Knicks. They swept that same Shaq and Penny team that had beat them the year before. Just beat the brakes off of them. And then in the finals, won 4-2 against the Seattle Supersonics, because as we know, Michael Jordan teams in the finals anyway do not go to Game 7. This team in every statistical category was top 5. in every single statistical category except for pace of play. I believe they were 20th in the league in pace of play, but in every other stat, so that's bench scoring, steals, assists, blocks, all that, they were top 5. Do you know how ridiculously hard that is to pull off as a team, to be top 5 in every single one of those categories? That's just nuts. Nuts that happened. That Bulls team was stupid good on defense, stupid good on offense, had the most regular season wins at the time, and finished it up with the chip. Had 4 Hall of Famers on that team. Yes, ladies and gents, the 95-96 Chicago Bulls are the greatest team of all time. They're number 1. You can argue some others, but by these numbers, yeah, they're number 1.